Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
Tempelhof Airport appeared like a large, round, and flat area. Final approach to landing, it required descending down over a cemetery and close to apartment buildings. When glancing to the right, we were passing buildings at balcony level.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Please follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss a single episode. The Berlin Airlift stands as one of the most significant events in Cold War history, a testament to the resilience and determination of the Allies in the face of Soviet adversity. I speak with 98-year-old veteran Ralph Dionne, who played a crucial role in this monumental operation. Ralph details the story of the Berlin Airlift and shares his journey from basic training to becoming a flight engineer. His insights provide a unique perspective of the challenges faced by military personnel tasked with delivering food, coal and other supplies under the threat of Soviet control. I'm delighted to welcome Ralph Dionne to our Cold War conversation.
As your Cold War Conversations podcasts cover the full spectrum of events and the individuals involved during the Cold War, I share your thought that this is an appropriate time to look back and recall how the Cold War began. Following World War II, defeated Germany was divided into two separate zones, that of the Allies consisting of the UK, the USA, and France, all occupying the western half of Germany, bordering on France. The eastern half of Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union, bordering with the former Poland. Unfortunately, the city of Berlin was located deep within the Soviet zone. The city itself was similarly divided, with the Allies controlling the western sectors and the Soviets controlling the eastern sector. In order for the Allies to support their three garrisons, quartered within their respective zones in the city, it was necessary to travel through Soviet-controlled territory that completely surrounded Berlin. Following World War II in 1945, early signs of disagreement began to develop between the Allies and the Soviets in occupied Germany, and they incrementally increased during 1946 and 1947. It was a period during which the Soviets aggressively installed and supported communist politicians in the city of Berlin, resulting in much discord and troubling incidents. On January 1st, 1947, the USA and the UK united their two western zones of occupation outside of Berlin to be known as Bizonia, which further increased Soviet tensions. In June, the European Recovery Program, known as the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, including Germany, added further to Soviet discontent. At that time, the Soviets did not want Germany to rebuild again into a powerful nation and become a new threat in the future. In early 1948, the three Allies secretly planned to combine their three Western zones into a new German state. When the Soviets discovered that the plan, they withdrew from participation in any further meetings of the Allied Control Council. On June 20th, 1948, the USA and UK secretly introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, in their Western Bizonia zone of control, and also in West Berlin. It was issued to further consolidate their zones of occupation and replace the current greatly inflated Soviet currency, the Reichsmark, which was in existence at that time. It quickly resulted in a very strong Soviet response, for on June 24th, which consisted of closing all roads, railroads, and barge travel to Berlin, thereby cutting off food, electricity, and coal to over 2 million West Berliners. Fortunately for the Allies, earlier on February 4th, 1945, a meeting had been held in Yalta, located in Crimea, between President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and dictator Joseph Stalin. during which the Allies were granted 3 permanent air corridors leading into Berlin in order to support the future Allied garrisons that would be stationed there.
Thanks, Ralph, for the background there. That's really useful to give some context. What was the reaction of the Allies to this blockade?
Well, the Allies realized they were now faced with a huge military challenge, and one that also required an immediate response. Fortunately, British Air Commodore Rex Waite, who was stationed in Berlin and responsible for air transportation matters, immediately sought to analyze the challenges faced to supply the garrisons and the blockaded citizens of West Berlin by aircraft. His calculations were sound, but also most demanding. Upon presentation of his calculations and recommendations to the British Commandant, General Herbert, the proposal failed to receive the general's support. Undaunted, Rex Waite next presented his calculations and recommendations to the British Commandant, General Robertson, who was impressed and subsequently discussed the matter further with U.S. Army General Clay, the military governor of Germany, whose response was most favorable, with the additional full support of President Harry S. Truman and USAF, which is U.S. Air Force in Europe. The first U.S. Air Force Berlin Airlift flight over Soviet-controlled territory into Berlin took place on June 26, 1948. Also, under full support of Air Marshal Arthur R. Tedder, RAF flights began 2 days later on June 28th. 1 month later, U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt S. Vandenberg appointed General William H. Tunner, the master of the famous Himalayan over-the-hump airlift operation during World War II, to be head of the Combined Airlift Task Force. The USA portion of the airlift effort became known as Operation Vittles, and the UK portion became known as Operation Plainfare. Time for a breather.
How are you doing, Ralph?
Well, I have to ask you that.
No, I'm fine.
I'm ready, Ian.
Okay, great. Well, Ralph, it's great to see the ideas of the British being taken on board there, but were any military options considered?
Yes, Ian. There were several options considered, both diplomatically and militarily. There were Allied governmental members who recommended the removal of Allied forces from blockaded Berlin. However, this abandonment would have been seen as a sign of Allied weakness and would have allowed the Soviet to assume complete control of Berlin. A diplomatic solution was considered. However, past experience of negotiating with the Soviets were very contentious and rarely resulted in success. Also, the Soviets had made it clear that they would require the Allies to remove their newly issued Deutschmark currency from Berlin, which the Allies positively would not do. There was also an aggressive military option considered. General Clay recommended that a railroad train loaded with fully armed infantry aboard be sent across Soviet territory to Berlin. This was seen as a very dangerous military provocation and would possibly result in World War III. As a result, the Allies had no other options to peacefully cope with the Soviet challenge than attempting to supply Berlin through the available open air corridors. The Allies were military at a great disadvantage. Following World War II, the Allied ground forces of both the UK and the USA had been returned to their respective countries and demobilized, no longer in a position to counter 1 million Soviet troops deployed in their European zones of occupation. However, secretly, and with the permission of Prime Minister Clement Attlee, on October 17th and 18th of 1948, 2 U.S. Air Force squadrons, each occupied with 30 atomic bomb-capable B-29 bombers, were deployed to RAF air bases in England. This was unknown by we, who were busy meeting the challenges of supplying Berlin by air. However, it was known by the Soviet High Command and dictator Joseph Stalin which effectively encountered any overt military interference at that time. But in fact, there was always the possibility of an unplanned military incident occurring and resulting in responses leading to World War III.
Now, what was your involvement in the airlift?
Well, it was also in late July of 1948 that my military assignment to serve in the Berlin Airlift took place. I wish to digress at this point to relate the past circumstances that led to my personal involvement in both military life and the Berlin Airlift. 1 year after World War II, in June of 1946, I had graduated from high school in the small city of Nashua, New Hampshire, in the USA. Having experienced an early and strong interest in military aviation of both World War I and World War II, I enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Force for a period of 3 years. As my enlistment included a possible GI Bill benefit of a college education, which could result in my being qualified for re-entry as an Air Force officer candidate, and hopefully would lead to a career in military aviation. I received basic training at the Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. From there, I was sent to the Keesler Air Force Base for technical training as an aircraft mechanic, specializing in Douglas C-54 aircraft maintenance. Following graduation, I was transferred to my permanent station at Westover Air Force Base, which was located on the East Coast near Boston. The air base served as a departure point for military air transport service flights to Europe. I had gained much experience at Westover, and by mid-1948 was promoted to the rank of sergeant. On July 26th, a notification appeared on our squadron bulletin board that listed the names of the officers and the enlisted personnel who were to report within 3 days to flight operations for departure to Germany. It was for a temporary period of 90 days with assignments to the 1250th Air Transport Squadron stationed at the Rhine-Main Air Force Base near the city of Frankfurt. All personnel involved were advised to bring their personal affairs up to date and to remove all personal property from the airbase, including their automobiles, to which I complied. On the day of departure, after a 3-hour flight delay, a fully loaded C-54 with personnel, duffel bags, and many toolboxes was finally on its way. As we flew past the Statue of Liberty, I recalled earlier seeing World War II news films of the many sailors and servicemen who cheered as they sailed past that great monument. They were off to war, and sadly, many never to return. Would I return?
Wow, that must have been some moment, that, Ralph.
Don't forget it.
Were you told what to expect in Germany? Did you know what the mission was at that point, even?
Well, Ian, to my recollection, there are no formal briefings held as to what to be expected in Germany. It was therefore assumed that we would be informed later upon reporting for duty in Germany. Prior to our departure, we were basically aware that there was something going on in Germany. We've seen in local newspapers the famous photo of C-47 aircraft parked in a semicircle being unloaded at the Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. The photo was not supported by a lot of detailed information concerning the operation itself. Newspapers were advised at that time to limit their information concerning the Berlin Airlift crisis, especially for any alarming news of incidents that could lead to our nation back to war. Our country was in a post-war peacetime role and ill-prepared for a return to wartime conditions. I'm sure the same situation applied to both the UK and France.
Yes, indeed, Ralph. Both the UK and France were in the process of post-war recovery and looking forward to renewing peaceful goals. But obviously this interrupted that. But Ralph, can you continue with your account of your flight to Germany?
Yes. During our flight from Westover Air Force Base, we stopped in Bermuda for food and fuel. Later, we departed for distant Europe. Following a long flight, we arrived the next day by midnight at the Rhine-Main Air Force Base. We were cleared through customs, after which our personal U.S. dollars were exchanged for U.S. military payment certificates known as script currency for use in the occupied zones. We were also advised that military non-fraternization rules were still in effect, which referred to non-contact for German civilians. It was also soon learned that it was neither heeded nor enforced. German civilian workers were crucial to our mission and were also found to be trustworthy. We were then transported from the air base via military buses driven by German drivers in darkness to the nearby city of Frankfurt, about a distance of 7.5 miles, to a gated compound with multiple story brick buildings that had served as past dormitories for Hitler's SS troops. There was a centralized mess hall with German workers, open 24 hours a day due to the around-the-clock airlift operation. The separate rooms included 4 single beds. However, due to our normal entering, sleeping, or departing our rooms at all hours, there was very little opportunity to chat and develop friendships. The living quarters at a number of other U.S. Air Force and RAF air bases, including those for the pilots and staff officers, were definitely primitive and very inadequate. The immediate influx of personnel from both air and sea transport was the cause of the imposed serious lodging challenges. Some nearby German family homes had to be evacuated on short notice in order to provide both living and administrative quarters for Allied personnel.
How are you doing, Ralph? So we took a short break at this point, and we come back with Ralph talking about his first impressions of Germany. So you've had your water, Ralph. You're ready to go, yeah?
I'm ready.
Fantastic. Okay. Ralph, what were your first impressions of Germany?
Well, on the first morning after mess, meaning breakfast to non-veterans, we boarded a waiting GI bus and were driven through the city of Frankfurt on our way to the Rhine-Main Air Base. The city was quiet, streets were devoid of cars, just a few people in sight, some on bicycles, mostly old and dressed in black clothing, many carrying satchels and often stopping to pick up discarded cigarette butts and carefully saving them. Daily, a number of women were gathered at the compound's front gate, receiving and returning GI clothing that were faithfully being laundered and pressed for payment in American cigarettes. Can you imagine living under such conditions? Soviet printed and issued money was worthless. The city was also scarred by many war-damaged buildings, reminders of the results of war, not to soon be forgotten. Arriving at the Rhine-Main Air Base was also an experience. We were driven to the opposite side of the airfield, where C-54s were parked in a line opposite a small maintenance and operations Quonset hut. There was much activity taking place. On the opposite side of the airbase's central runway, 2 U.S. Navy squadrons of C-54 aircraft had arrived with their air crews, maintenance, and administrative personnel to include their supply of C-54 spare parts. The airbase was also becoming a beehive of maintenance and flight activity. Daily aircraft maintenance was performed outside around the clock, regardless of the time or the weather, often in wet, cold, and muddy field conditions. Wooden ladders, including flashlights at night, were in use to remove engine cowling, to work on the engines and their accessories. Eventually, wooden roofed work stands were constructed to improve access to the C-54's engines for inspection and maintenance. Indeed, the constant 24 hours of flight operations resulted in substantial needs for replacements such as engine spark plugs, 112 per C-54 aircraft, batteries, starters, wheel brakes, tires, electrical and hydraulic components, and cleaning of the aircraft.
Yeah, I think people forget how much work there is behind the scenes to keep an aircraft flying, and you've illustrated that well there. I'm interested to know, what was the attitude of the incoming air crews that had served in World War II, that had actually fought the Germans?
Well, in both the military and civilian situational attitude was very important at that time. A number of American and British pilots and airmen involved in World War II had been bombing Berlin and in return were shot at or captured. They and the Berliners who survived were not on the best of terms. However, the Soviets had now become the common aggressor, which made a considerable difference as we are now on the same team. In late June, as a friendly gesture, a young U.S. Air Force pilot began dropping candy bars and gum attached to small parachutes from his C 54 aircraft during its landing approach. The German children, who were safely behind the perimeter fence, were the recipients. It also became a very significant factor in the airlift. The pilots' continued acts of kindness led to the children telling their parents about the airmen's caring and generous effort of dropping candy to them. The children had suffered greatly during the war and certainly had been devoid of gum and candy bars for many years. The lieutenant pilot's name was Gail S. Halverson, who became known as the Candy Bomber. The candy drop effort was subsequently officially approved and expanded into Operation Little Vittles, which became a true symbol of hope and friendship for the Berliners.
Yeah, that's a great story. I was lucky enough to interview Gail Halverson, and I'll make sure I
Great.
link to that episode in the episode notes when this gets published. How did the West Berliners react to the airlift?
The West Berliners reacted with appreciation for the attention provided to the children. They also soon became aware of the serious efforts being made by the Allied forces to break the Soviet blockade, and they were also invited to assist. The Berliners rallied and provided support in every way possible. The help was needed to provide security, construction, transportation, and aircraft maintenance services, to include the loading and unloading of aircraft that brought food, milk, coal, and critical supplies to the city. They were also involved in the final distribution of the cargoes to the intended recipients. The all important coal came from the mines of France. It was required to keep the only power plant in the Allied zone of Berlin operational. It generated the needed electricity to operate the pumps, maintaining pipeline water flow, and for continued discharge of the city's sewage waste. Each Berlin family was also supplied with a meager allotment of 1 hod of coal per week for heating and cooking purposes. An outstanding example of reciprocal help from Berliners developed when there was a critical need for a third airport in Berlin to receive additional food and supplies. The French military authorities had open land available in the French zone of Berlin, and under their supervision began construction of a 7,966-foot runway. It was made possible through the assistance of 17,000 German civilian workforce, of which 40% were women. The pay rate was just over 1 Deutschmark per hour and 1 meal per day, of which portions were brought home to their children. The runway was built from shattered brick debris from city buildings, rolled and paved over with 10,000 50-gallon drums of asphalt, which had to be flown into Berlin. Also, the required steamrollers and equipment had to be torch cut into pieces, flown into Berlin, and re-welded for use on the construction site. It was a massive challenge, and Tegel became operational within an incredible 3 months.
That's great stuff, Ralph. Do you want to have another swig of water and have a
Yes.
break? We're over halfway now, so by the looks of it. But really appreciate you reading this for me, and it's an honour to be speaking to a Berlin Airlift veteran as well.
Come down here.
Okay, Ralph, are you ready for round 3? I think,
yes,
or
sir.
round 2. Okay.
Yes,
Ralph, did you fly in the airlift yourself?
yes, Ian. After my having provided 3 months of full maintenance support, my temporary duty status in Germany was extended for another 90 days. When I next reported for work at our squadron's operation hut, I was informed that my military occupational specialty classification had been upgraded to that of a flight engineer. I was also informed to report to the pilot in command of a specific C-54 parked across the taxi strip. My parting brief instructions were to assist in flight duties and follow the pilot's exact instructions at all times. After meeting and greeting the pilot and the co-pilot, we completed our assigned aircraft walk-around inspection, then climbed a ladder located at the rear doors of the C-54 and entered the cargo area. It was loaded with 10 tons of coal, all packed and tied down in duffel bags. The pilot and the co-pilot proceeded forward to the cockpit in preparation for flight. My typical duties continued as follows. While I remained positioned at the open cargo door, a ground crew member removed the external landing gear locks and passed them up to me. The 6-foot removable tail post was also passed up to be stored. The 10-foot entrance ladder was then lifted and stored inside. Then I closed and securely latched the 2 cargo doors. Proceeding forward, slightly aft and being between the pilot and co-pilot, close to the various manual controls for lowering or retracting the landing gear, for the lowering or raising of the wing flaps to the requested settings by the pilot in command. During the initial engine startups and in flight, I monitored all engine and oil-related instruments for correct quantities, pressures, and operating temperatures. When at cruising level, I adjusted the engine and propeller pitch settings to achieve a smooth running harmony. After our flight arrival in Berlin and the aircraft is parked and the engines are shut down, I returned to the cargo cabin area and opened the cargo door to admit access by the unloading crew waiting in a trailer truck. Within a half hour, we were again lining up to a line of similar aircraft, 5 or 6 ahead, with engines idling, and all awaiting the eventual control tower's call for pilots to line up on the runway, apply takeoff power, and return to your home bases.
Wow, Ralph, that's a great description there. Can you remember your first flight to Berlin and what you were warned about?
Yes, my first flight to Berlin was unique in that it was very different from my prior maintenance duties to learning all flight duties involved and actually being on the delivery end of the essential supplies to Berliners. The initial experience of seeing Berlin from the air as we descended to lower altitudes was stunning at that time, for many scars of war were still most evident from the results of prior bombings. Tempelhof Airport appeared like a large, round, and flat area in the middle of a huge city of tall buildings. On final approach to landing, it required descending down over a cemetery and close to apartment buildings. When glancing to the right, we were passing buildings at balcony level, which was a very unusual experience. We also were warned that during the unloading procedure of our aircraft in Berlin, we were to remain close to our aircraft and not wander, due to the amount of aircraft activity and the necessity of departing as soon as our aircraft was unloaded. However, as a benefit, a lunch wagon would come by and stop. Coffee and donuts would be served by its select and very attractive Fraulein crew. Compliments of General Tunner. That's human nature. That's great.
Absolutely. Are you okay to carry on?
Well, let's see how it works, and if not, we'll.
Okay.
We're doing pretty good, but
stop whenever you need a drink. At this point, we take another short break while Ralph needed to just stand up and do a few stretches. I'm imagining you now, Ralph, doing a few press ups or something, but maybe not. Right, you ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay, right. Um, can you tell me what it was like flying through those air corridors over what was effectively Soviet territory?
Well, there were three corridors that converged into Berlin. They were 20 miles wide and extended up to a height of 10,000 feet. The flight levels began at 3,000 feet and progressed upwards in 500-foot increments. The southern and northern corridors were designated for flights going into Berlin. The central corridor was designated for flights leaving Berlin. There was a radio beacon located at both the beginning and at the end of each corridor, designed to keep aircraft centered within the corridors. While in flight, pilots listened for an over the beacon radio time report of the aircraft ahead in order to adjust their own airspeed that required the maintaining of a 3-minute horizontal separation from the aircraft ahead, regardless of their individual assigned flight levels. During our flight, forward and side visual vigilance was maintained by both pilots who would report all unusual sightings or activities either then or upon return to their air bases.
Did you see any Soviet aircraft on any of your flights?
No, Ian, all flights during which I had participated were free of Soviet air activity and beacon signal interferences.
I've read that the weather was a real challenge, particularly during the winter. How bad did the weather get?
Ian, the weather was a prime concern during the Berlin Airlift. The Soviets believed that when the harsh winter conditions from the north flowed down over Europe, the airlift would come to a freezing halt. For whatever reason, it turned out to be a relatively mild winter, but one that still resulted in elements of ice, fog, mist, and rain.
And what were the most challenging elements of the weather for you?
I feel that icing conditions were the most challenging encountered. On the ground, it made both the steering of aircraft while taxiing and braking while landing very treacherous. Also very dangerous when attempting to take off heavily loaded. Mitigating measures were taken to employ the use of de-icing procedures on aircraft prior to flight. Most aircraft encountering icing conditions during flight were equipped for the de-icing of wing, tail, and propeller leading edges. However, the frequency of icing conditions was far exceeded by fog conditions. They were more pervasive both day and night, certainly also treacherous in all phases of flying, landing, and ground operations. On November 20th, 42 flights departed for Berlin, and only one aircraft was able to land in Berlin.
Well, did you experience any operational problems during your flights?
Yes, Ian, the only incident that was experienced and occurred when we were on a return flight from Tempelhof. The number 4 right outboard engine was rapidly dropping. It necessitated the engine to be shut down and the propeller blades to be feathered, meaning aligned with the airstream to reduce drag. We continued our flight and successfully returned to the Rhine-Main Air Force Base.
What instructions were you given if you did have to make a forced landing in the Soviet zone?
Nothing. We didn't discuss crashes or anything. We didn't have time. We just doing our job. That kept us going, you know.
Are you ready for the next question, Ralph?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you hear about any incidents from other aircrew members?
Well, while on duty, the topic was not discussed or dwelled upon. After completion of our 12-hour tours of duty, the enlisted flight engineers and the rated officer pilots soon returned to their respective separate quarters for rest and recuperation, and after 12 hours, returned to duty again. Therefore, it resulted in very few discussions concerning incidents of fatal aircraft crashes. However, many of the interesting incidents of the past surfaced in later years as Berlin Airlift veterans circulated their stories at their reunions and provided information for publication in their organizational newsletters. More incidents were later documented as a result of personal interviews being documented for preservation by book authors and military museums.
Due to the many operational challenges encountered during the Berlin Airlift, was it overall a safe operation, would you say?
Well, during the Berlin Airlift operation, there were 17 American and 8 British aircraft crashes. In total, there were 101 recorded fatalities from all causes, which included 21 Americans and 40 British. However, they were mostly associated with non-flying accidents. The Berlin Airlift was a relatively safe operation. Both the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy performed during the airlift at 50% of the prevailing accident rate of the remaining U.S. Air Force at that time. The RAF, including its civilian components, also had a remarkably good safety record, considering that 277,000 flights were recorded for flying over a distance of 92 million miles while delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies to Berlin. The mission was well accomplished and certainly still deserving of recognition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you summarize your overall participation in the Berlin Airlift, Ralph?
Yes. Eventually, my full 6 months of deployment came to an end. From a C-54 maintainer to a flight engineer and having accumulated 300 flying hours. In essence, it involves 74 C-54 flights to Berlin, one flight to a maintenance base near Munich, another to the RAF Burtonwood Maintenance Base in England, to include a round trip back to the USA in a C-54 requiring a 1,000-hour inspection. The return flight back to Germany was made in a different C-54 that had received its 1,000-hour inspection and maintenance. There were no issues encountered during the return flight to Germany. After having completed my second tour of deployment, I was flown back to the USA on February 18, 1949, to resume maintenance duty in my original 14th Air Transport Squadron. On September 5th, 1949, my 3 years of U.S. Air Force service terminated.
What did you do after leaving the U.S. Air Force?
After returning home, I immediately applied for and was accepted as a student of Boston University, majoring in business administration. The reason that there are no sequel military stories to relate is that during my third year of college, I became engaged and married. Following graduation 1 year later, I discussed with my loved one my wish to re-enlist. I was politely but firmly advised by a charming Irish red-headed wife that I belonged to her and not to the U.S. government. It was the end of the conversation, for a happy wife means a happy life. It is so true.
That is very true, Ralph. You definitely made the right choice there. Did you miss flying after leaving the U.S. Air Force?
Yes. While raising 3 sons and serving for 12 years as president of a civil aviation flying club, there were many local flights enjoyed with family and friends over a period of 20 years. I retired in 1991 from a large corporation and had been involved in a progress series of supervisory assignments. I've been a member of both the Experimental Aircraft Association and the 495th Squadron Radio Control Model Club since 1987.
And I understand you've also been involved in Berlin Airlift reunions.
Yes, I had also joined the Berlin Airlift Veterans Association, and in 1999 attended the 50th anniversary of the Berlin Airlift held in Berlin. The city provided an unbelievable reception. The stadium in Berlin was filled with Berliners and attended by over a half dozen busloads of UK, French, and USA veterans. The ceremonies were opened by a British military parachute team that landed in the center of the stadium. Both USA, UK, and German military bands and drill teams performed flawlessly, and the late night was capped by a magnificent display of fireworks. I have since attended many stateside annual Berlin Airlift Veterans reunions, including an additional 3 held in Berlin. The most recent return to Berlin with Allied participation was held on May 11th and 12th of 2024 for the city's celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Berlin Airlift. The reception in Berlin was formal, exceptional, and sincere. Formal plaque dedications were held for Commodore Rex Waite and Colonel Gail Halverson. During the last 3 years, I served as president of the Berlin Airlift Veterans Association, which held its final reunion in early October of 2024, to be finally and sadly dissolved on March 31st, 2025.
Okay, Ralph, last question, and then we're done. So you've done absolutely brilliantly. So look, I'm really looking forward to listening back to this. But anyway, the last question is, what do you think when you look back at your service in such a significant Cold War event?
Reflecting back over the past, the experience of the Berlin Airlift remains strongly in mind. Indeed, had the airlift effort not succeeded, Western Europe could have been under Soviet influence ever since, a far cry from the freedom that exists today. At worst, the situation could have resulted in World War III. Fortunately, that situation did not prevail, for the continued Allied Cold War efforts kept the Soviet Union in check for many years and ultimately resulted in the Soviet Union's temporary dissolution in 1991 and is now known as the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, unheeded history has a way of repeating itself. Although the Cold War experience of the last century provided strong lessons, we should be very concerned about what lessons will be relearned during the present century.
Brilliant work there, Ralph. Right on the hour as well. Perfect timing, just like flying through those corridors, Ralph.
Oh boy, that was something. Oh man.
He's an amazing guy.
Absolutely. No, it's a as I said before, Ralph, it's just been a real honor to speak with you. I mean, do you mind me asking, how old are you?
97, 98 and 2 months.
Wow.
That is amazing.
Wow. That is amazing.
Not to me. No.
And an amazing story as well. And just having you reflect on being part of such a major Cold War event and hearing you describe it is just phenomenal. And I know that the listeners of Cold War Conversations will really appreciate you allowing us to record your story. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War Conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.